Zeno of Citium came to Athens carrying almost nothing. The ship that had brought him from Phoenicia had gone down somewhere near the Piraeus, taking with it the cargo of purple dye that had been the foundation of his merchant livelihood, and leaving him on the shore of a city that was not his own, with the kind of enforced stillness that only catastrophe can produce. He was in his 30s. The life he had built was gone, and somewhere in the interval between that loss and whatever came next, something shifted in the direction of his attention, away from the external arrangements of commerce and toward the interior architecture of a mind trying to understand what had just happened to it. Athens in 300 BCE was a city where philosophy was not yet a discipline confined to institutions, but something practiced in walkways and market squares, under colonnades, and in small rented rooms. The Stoa Poikiel, the painted porch, stood on the north side of the agora, its long colonnade, decorated with murals of great battles and mythological scenes, open on one side to the air and the movement of the city, shaded on the other by its painted walls. It was a public space, not a private one. Anyone could walk past. Anyone could stop and listen. Zeno chose it because its openness suited something about the philosophy he was beginning to develop, a philosophy that did not retreat from the ordinary world, but asked to be tested against it, daily and without exception. He stood in that colonnaded space and began to teach. The people who gathered around him were not students who had paid for admission or disciples who had renounced other commitments. They were people who had stopped, listened, and found that what they were hearing described something they recognized but had not had words for. The sense that between the things that happen to a person and the way that person responds to them, there is a gap, and that the whole of a moral life is conducted inside that gap. Zeno had not invented this observation. Earlier philosophers had circled it from various directions, but what Zeno did with it was precise in a way that earlier formulations had not been. He drew the line carefully. On one side of it, the impression that the world delivers, the provocation received, the thing that arrives unbidden and presses against the surface of awareness. On the other side, the action taken, the word spoken, the choice made and released into consequences. Between those two sides, between the arrival and the departure, Zeno placed the whole moral weight of a human life, not in what happened, not in what was said or done in return, in the quality of what occurred in the space between them. This was not a small claim. For the world Zeno was living in, it was almost a reversal of ordinary moral thinking. The dominant view held that character was expressed in action, that virtue was visible in behavior, that a person's quality could be read from the things they did and the honors they accumulated. Zeno was saying something different. He was saying that moral responsibility was located not in the action, but in the assent that preceded it, in the moment when a mind, presented with an impression, decided whether to let that impression pass through it, undirected, or to apply the governing intelligence that was already present and waiting to be used. The word the Stoics used for that governing intelligence was the hegemonikon. It referred to the ruling part of the soul, the seat of reason and perception, and the faculty that managed whether an impulse became an action or was held back, examined, and either endorsed or refused. The quality of an entire human life, in the Stoic understanding, was a function of how well this ruling faculty was cultivated, not how much wealth it managed to accumulate, not how high in the social order it rose, not what it accomplished by the measures that civic life used to assign worth, how well it was kept aligned with rational nature, how carefully it was trained to govern the stream of impressions the world delivered, rather than being carried by that stream wherever it happened to run. The hegemonicon receives an impression, a word spoken sharply, a piece of news that shifts the ground, a plan that fails, and for one moment, before assent has been given, it rests in its own governing stillness. Neither compelled nor yet committed, the impression is present, the mind has received it, but nothing has been decided. The ruling faculty stands at the threshold between what has arrived and what will be done, and in that standing, the entire architecture of Stoic philosophy is already present, already waiting to be understood. Zeno's students gathered in the painted colonnade and listened to him work through this architecture with the careful patience of someone who had thought about it for years and was still, even in the act of teaching, refining its edges. The Stoa Poikila was not a place of silence. The city moved past it. Merchants went about their business. Children and dogs and the ordinary commerce of a populated square carried on in the middle distance, and into that ordinary noise, Zeno spoke about the threshold between a provocation received and an action taken, gesturing occasionally toward the chest, where the Stoics believed the ruling faculty resided, as if to indicate that what he was describing was not a theory but an address, a location inside the body where philosophy could be found, doing its work in every waking moment. What made the teaching unusual was what it asked of people. It did not ask for withdrawal from ordinary life. It did not prescribe retirement to a quiet room or a garden, removed from the provocations of the world. It asked that people remain fully in the world, in their households and their political arrangements, in their professional obligations and their personal difficulties, and learn to find, inside all of that, the one thing that was entirely and unconditionally their own, the pause, the interval, the breath of governance between what was received and what was given back. The philosopher who would articulate this most precisely was not Zeno, but a man who had come to Stoicism from a position of absolute material disadvantage. Epictetus was born into slavery. The dates are uncertain, but he taught in Rome under Nero and later fled to Nicopolis in northwestern Greece, where he established a school that drew students from across the ancient world, including eventually Marcus Aurelius, who encountered his work through a teacher and never forgot it. What Epictetus brought to the Stoic inheritance was a precision about the nature of freedom that the earlier formulations had gestured at without fully mapping. He called it proheresis. The word referred to moral choice, to the faculty of deliberate rational selection that stood behind all voluntary action. Proheres was the thing that chose, the thing that evaluated an impression and decided what to do with it, the thing that could assent to a proposed action or withhold that assent and ask the impression to account for itself before being let through. And Epictetus's claim about proheres was stark and held without qualification. It was the only thing in the universe that was entirely and unconditionally within a person's power, not the only important thing, not the most important thing among several. The only thing, full stop, without exception, regardless of external circumstance. A person's body could be enslaved, their property could be taken, their reputation could be destroyed, their relationships severed, their physical comfort eliminated entirely. None of this touched proheres. The capacity to choose one's assent, to decide what impressions would be let through and acted on, and what impressions would be held at the door and examined before being invited to govern behavior. This capacity remained intact under any external condition imaginable, because it operated at a level deeper than external conditions could reach. This was the argument Epictetus made in a small teaching room in Nicopolis to students who had traveled considerable distances to hear it. He sat, probably on a simple chair or bench. His surviving writings describe a practical, unornamented setting, and he speaks with the directness of someone who has no interest in impressing his listeners with surroundings. He told them that the slave who had ordered his proharis was freer than the emperor who had not. He told them this plainly, without the quality of paradox that it might seem to carry on first hearing, because for Epictetus it was not a paradox. It was a description of what freedom actually was, when looked at carefully enough to distinguish it from the things that could be taken away. The students sat with this. A teaching room in Nicopolis would have been quiet by the standards of modern distraction. No background noise beyond what the city produced naturally. No technology competing for attention. They sat with the argument and let it find its edges. The idea that a slave was freer than an emperor was not a reversal of ordinary moral intuitions designed to shock. It was an invitation to look more carefully at what the word freedom was actually pointing at. When they looked carefully enough, the paradox dissolved, not into agreement necessarily, not all at once, but into something more interesting than either agreement or disagreement. The recognition that the argument was touching something real, even if its full shape was not yet visible. Epictetus had lived the argument from the inside. He knew what it meant to have no control over the circumstances of his daily life, who commanded him, where he slept, what he was required to do, and from inside those constraints he had found, through long attention to the Stoic framework, that prohairesis remained untouched. Not because his life was good or comfortable, or just, it was not, but because the faculty of assent operated independently of external circumstance, and no external circumstance, however severe, could follow it into the interior space where it did its work. To understand how the Stoics thought about this interior space, it helps to understand how they thought about the territory that surrounds it, the territory of the passions, or path. The Stoic analysis of emotion was not, as it is sometimes misread, an argument that emotions should be eliminated, or that a philosophical life was a cold and feelingless one. The Stoics had a more precise position than that. They distinguished between two kinds of emotional experience. The pathal were irrational, excessive disturbances, understood not as natural feelings, but as cognitive errors, as mistaken judgments about the value of things. Anger that treated an insult as a genuine damage to the self. Fear that treated the loss of something external as the loss of something essential. Grief that treated what had been taken away as what had actually constituted the self's worth. These were not described as natural and inevitable. They were described as errors, and errors could in principle be corrected. On the other side stood what the Stoics called eupatheia, well-reasoned emotional responses that remained proportionate, deliberate, and aligned with what was genuinely within one's power, caution rather than fear, wishing rather than craving, joy that arose from a genuine good, the exercise of virtue, the proper ordering of the ruling faculty, rather than from the acquisition of something external that could be removed. The Stoics were not arguing against emotional life. They were arguing for a different understanding of where genuine emotional health came from and what it felt like when it was present. The distinction mattered because it located the problem precisely. Destructive emotional experience was not, in the Stoic view, something that happened to a person from outside. It was something that arose from within, specifically from the habitual failure of the ruling faculty to apply appropriate scrutiny to the impressions it received. The pathe were what the hegemonicon produced when it was not doing its governing work. The eupatheia were what it produced when it was. The difference was not fortune or temperament. The difference was practice, the ongoing, deliberate cultivation of the faculty that stood between the arriving impression and the assented response. There is a figure that helps hold this. A person in the middle of an argument, not yet speaking, standing in the moment, between what they feel and what they will say. The feeling is present, the impression has arrived, and is pressing for assent. But something else is also present, the ruling faculty, not yet committed, still holding the space between reception and response. In that held moment, the Stoic philosophy of the hegemon is already present and already practicing, not as theory, not as something remembered from reading or study, as a lived fact of consciousness available to anyone who has learned to recognize it. What Zeno gave to his students in the painted colonnade, what Epictetus gave to his students in Nicopolis, was not primarily a set of arguments to be memorized and reproduced. It was a way of attending to that moment, of recognizing it when it arrived, of understanding what it contained, of cultivating the capacity to stand in it long enough to use it. The arguments were in service of the practice. The practice was the governance of the ruling faculty, and the governance of the ruling faculty was, in the Stoic understanding, the governance of a life. The Stoic system rested, at its deepest level, on a single vast claim about the nature of the universe. The cosmos, in Stoic understanding, was not a random collection of matter, moving without direction. It was organized by logos, a rational principle that structured the whole of existence, animated the movement of stars and seasons, and the ordering of natural processes, and expressed itself in the capacity for reason that was present in every human mind. Logos was not a god in the personal interventionist sense. It was more like an intelligence that the cosmos expressed from within, a principle of rational order that pervaded everything and was not external to the world, but constitutive of it. And in every human mind, the Stoics argued, there resided a fragment of this cosmic logos, not a copy of it or a representation of it, but an actual portion of the same rational principle that structured the universe. This was why the ruling faculty mattered so deeply. To cultivate the hegemon was not merely to improve one's personal functioning or one's emotional equilibrium. It was to bring the inner life into alignment with the same rational order that moved the stars. The pause between stimulus and response, when properly understood, was not a technique for getting through difficult moments. It was the place where the fragment of cosmic logos, present in the individual mind, was given the chance to do what it was constituted to do, to govern, to measure, to align the local and particular with the vast and rational. Logos, as the Stoics understood, it was both external and internal simultaneously. The same rational principle that ordered the rotation of the heavens was present in the mind of the merchant who had just lost his ship and was deciding what to do next. In the mind of the student trying to understand why a slave might be freer than an emperor. In the mind of anyone standing in that unremarkable and philosophically crucial moment between what had happened and what they were about to do about it. This gave the Stoic framework a scope that separated it from purely practical self-improvement. The person who learned to pause before responding was not simply developing a useful skill for managing difficult situations. In the Stoic understanding, they were in that pause, briefly touching the same order that moved the stars, allowing the rational principle that was present in them as a fragment of cosmic logos to perform its governing function, rather than being overridden by the speed of an impression's transit from arrival to action. The scope of the claim is significant, but the Stoics were careful not to let it become abstract in a way that detached it from practice. Logos was not something to be contemplated in isolation from daily life. It was something to be expressed in daily life, in the quality of each day's ascents, in the care with which the ruling faculty engaged with each arriving impression, in the accumulated practice of a life spent attending to the space between stimulus and response. The cosmic and the ordinary were not separate domains. The cosmic was present in the ordinary, waiting to be expressed through the cultivation of the ruling faculty that every human being already possessed. Zeno, in the painted colonnade, understood this. He had not gone looking for philosophy in the abstract. He had come to it through loss, through the enforced stillness of a catastrophe that had stripped away the external structure of his life and left him standing in a gap between what had been and what would come next. In that gap, before he knew what to call it, he had already been living inside the question that his philosophy would spend decades trying to articulate, the space between what happens and what is done about it, the place where the ruling faculty either does its work or fails to. His students gathered in the open air of the Stoa Poikile and listened. The city moved past them. The world continued its ordinary operations. And in that ordinary context, not in retreat or isolation or careful philosophical silence, but in the noise and movement of a functioning city, Zeno described the architecture of the responding mind with a precision that would outlast the building he stood in, the city that surrounded it, and the empire that would eventually absorb and transform the tradition he was beginning. The students who walked away from his teaching carried with them not primarily arguments, though the arguments were careful and worth carrying. They carried a way of attending to a moment that most people moved through so quickly they could not see it. The moment between the impression and the response, the threshold between what had arrived and what would be done, the space in which the ruling faculty stood in its own governing stillness, neither compelled nor yet committed, with the whole question of a human response still open. What the Stoics were offering was not a set of techniques for handling stress or managing emotional difficulty. They were offering an account of what a human being actually was, what the mind's deepest architecture looked like when examined with care, what it was constituted to do, and what it required in order to do it well. The hegemonicon was not a feature of some minds only. It was present in every mind, already there, already capable of its governing function. What was required was not its installation, but its cultivation, the ongoing attentive practice of bringing it to bear on the impressions that arrived, one by one, through the course of a lived day. The practice had a quality of rediscovery to it. A student who learned to recognize the ruling faculty in themselves was not encountering something new, but something that had always been present, a governing capacity that had been there in every moment of their life, including the moments when it had not been consulted. Epictetus made this point with the kind of bluntness that was characteristic of him. The faculty was already there. Prohairesis was already there. The capacity to apply logos to the arriving impression before letting it through to action was already there. What had been missing was not the capacity, but the attention, the trained awareness of the governing faculty's presence, and the habit of turning to it, deliberately and without urgency, before each assent was given. This is what made the Stoa philosophy, at its foundation, something other than a philosophical system in the academic sense. It was a philosophy of practice, but practice understood in a specific way, not as a regimen of exercises performed at set times, but as a continuous orientation of the mind toward its own governing function. The ruling faculty was always present and always available. The practice was simply the ongoing act of remembering that it was there. A night in Athens, in the years when Zeno was still refining his teaching, the painted colonnade is empty, the city quieter than the day but not quiet. Cities at night in the ancient world had their own particular sounds, the movement of people and animals, and the occasional flare of lamplight across an open square. Somewhere in the city, A person is lying awake with something difficult turning in their mind, an insult received, the decision not yet made, an impression that arrived during the day and has not yet been resolved, that keeps returning and pressing for a response. In the Stoic understanding, this is precisely the moment when the ruling faculty matters most, not in the dramatic moments of large decision, though it matters there too, in the ordinary, persistent, unremarkable experience of an impression that will not settle, the kind of mental turning that belongs to the nighttime and that most people know from the inside without having a vocabulary for it. The hegemonicon, even in the dark, even in the hour when resolve is softest, is present, logos is present, proheresis is present. The capacity to examine the impression before giving it the assent it is asking for has not gone anywhere. It is there, available, waiting with the quality of something that does not need to announce itself, a compass needle that does not create north, but points to it steadily in whatever direction one happens to be facing. The Stoics spent a great deal of careful philosophical energy on the question of what logos actually was, on its metaphysical nature, its relationship to the divine, its place in the larger Stoic account of the cosmos as a rationally ordered whole. These are not questions with simple answers, and the philosophers who worked on them knew this. The Stoic school had internal debates about the nature of logos that lasted for generations, and the different formulations they developed are worth knowing if what one wants is a complete philosophical picture. But underneath all of that careful metaphysical work, there was something simpler and more immediate, an internal standard, a way of asking about any proposed response to any arriving impression, whether it was the response that reason endorsed or merely the one that the unexamined emotion demanded. Not a standard imposed from outside, not a set of rules issued by authority, but something that was already present in the mind by virtue of what the mind was, a fragment of the same rational order that structured everything, available in every moment to measure every impression against the question of whether it was what it appeared to be. Zeno standing in the painted colonnade, gesturing toward the chest where the ruling faculty resided. Epictetus in his small teaching room, explaining without bitterness that the years of enslavement had been the precise laboratory in which the theory of inner freedom had been tested and had held. A person in the middle of a conversation that has grown difficult, not yet speaking, standing in the moment between the impression and the response, the ruling faculty, present and quiet and available in the way that it always is, whether or not it is being consulted. Logos does not press for attention. It does not announce itself loudly or compete with the noise of an arriving impression. It is simply there, the way a compass needle is there, not creating direction, but indicating it, not imposing an answer, but offering the internal standard against which any answer can be measured before it is given. The person who learns to consult it is not acquiring a new faculty. They are returning with greater deliberateness to one they have always had. The return is quiet. It has the quality of something remembered rather than something new. And in the remembering, the space between what has arrived and what will be done expands just enough to allow the ruling faculty to do what it was always constituted to do, to govern, to measure, to align the local moment with the rational order that is present in it, waiting, as it has always been, to be found. Marcus Aurelius was writing by lamplight. The night was quiet around him, or as quiet as a military encampment along the Danube could be. The distant sound of the river, the occasional passage of a guard, the small sounds of a campaign tent settling against the cold. He was not composing orders or reviewing dispatches. He had set those aside. What he was doing in the cramped and private hand of a man writing only for himself, was asking whether his anger earlier in the day had been worth it, not whether it had been appropriate, not whether the officer who had frustrated him had deserved it, whether it had served anything, whether it had been, in the plainest philosophical sense, useful. He wrote the question down. He sat with it. He returned to the page with something that looked, in the way he arranged the words, very much like an answer he had already known before he asked. The meditations were never meant to be read. This is not a detail to be passed over lightly. A man who ruled the largest empire the Western world had yet organized, who commanded armies and adjudicated the lives of millions, who was consulted on questions of law and policy and military strategy from one end of the Mediterranean to the other. This man kept a private philosophical journal that he addressed to himself, in the second person, as if the author needed to be reminded of what the author already believed. The repetition is not evidence of confusion. It is evidence of something else entirely, the knowledge that understanding a principle and living it are different activities, that the distance between comprehension and practice must be crossed again every day, that the crossing itself is the work and cannot be done in advance. He returned to the same questions repeatedly, whether an impression is what it appears to be, whether a response serves reason or merely serves the feeling that preceded it, whether the space between what arrives and what is chosen has been used well. What he was doing in those nighttime sentences written to no audience was practicing the widening of that space, not performing it, not describing it, practicing it the way a musician practices scales, not because they are interesting, but because the fingers need to learn what the mind already knows, and the learning happens through the doing, and the doing must happen again the following night, and the night after that. There is a word in Stoic philosophy for the raw, unprocessed arrival of a thing before judgment has been applied to it. The Stoics called it a fantasia, an impression, an appearance, the first event in the chain that leads from the world's presenting itself to a person's responding to it. A fantasia is what arrives before anything has been decided about it. It is the sound of an unexpected knock before the thought, "Who is it?" has formed. It is the tone in someone's voice before the interpretation, "They are angry," has settled into place. It is the impression of a thing before the impression has become a belief. The distinction sounds fine, almost too fine to matter, until the moment when it begins to matter completely, which tends to be the moment when the impression is unpleasant and the impulse to respond immediately is very strong. The Stoics had mapped this territory with care. Long before any modern account of how emotional responses move through the body and mind, they had identified the first moment of a thing's arriving as the location where the entire chain of what follows could be interrupted, redirected, or allowed to continue unchanged. The fantasia arrives. It has not yet become anything. It is still only an appearance, a presentation, a report from the senses, and the initial perceptual apparatus before the evaluating mind has moved toward it. For one moment, it rests there. Not yet a belief, not yet an emotion, not yet an impulse toward action, still only what it is in its first form, the raw event of something having occurred and registered. What happens next is what interested the Stoics most deeply. Chrysippus, working in Athens in the 3rd century BCE, had thought through the precise logical structure of this moment, with the kind of careful attention that takes a lifetime to develop and produces arguments that last for centuries. He had concluded that what happens next is always, in principle, voluntary. The movement from impression to belief, the giving of assent, the synkatathesis, the moment when the mind says yes to the impression and lets it become a conviction about the world, was not, in his account, a mechanical or compelled event. It was a judgment. It might be a judgment made so quickly that it felt like no judgment at all. It might be a judgment made so habitually that it seemed to require no deliberation. But underneath the speed, underneath the habit, the structure of the event was the same. The impression arrived, and the mind moved toward it and accepted it as true. And that movement was the place where, if the mind were sufficiently trained and sufficiently attentive, the chain could be touched. The argument is not that people always pause before they respond. They do not. The argument is that the pause is always available, that the structure of experience always includes the threshold between impression and assent, and that the threshold can be learned to inhabit. This is a different kind of claim. It does not require that anyone be immediately capable of it. It requires only that the architecture of the mind includes this door, and that the door once found can be used. Marcus Aurelius, writing in the lamplight along the Danube, was not a man who had mastered this effortlessly. The evidence is in the very existence of the Meditations. A man who had achieved untroubled equanimity would not need to remind himself, night after night, in the same patient and sometimes self-exasperated hand, to test his impressions before accepting them. He would simply do it. The journal is a record of the practice, not of its completion, and the practice is precisely what makes the journal worth keeping. The daily return to the same ground, the same questions, the same slow cultivation of the space between what appears and what is chosen. What Marcus was doing in those private sentences was something Epictetus had named and placed at the center of all practical Stoic philosophy: the discipline of working consistently with the distinction between what is epictemen and what is uk epictemen, what is up to us and what is not up to us. The distinction sounds simple. It runs deep. What is up to us, Epictetus taught, is a very short list: our judgments, our values, our assents, our impulses, our desires and aversions, as they have been shaped by our own choices over time. What is not up to us is everything else: the behavior of other people, the outcomes of our actions, the weather of events, the body's health, the world's responsiveness to our preferences. Everything outside that short list is, in the Stoic understanding, not properly ours, and treating it as ours is the source of almost all unnecessary suffering. But the distinction is not, in Epictetus's hands, a counsel of withdrawal or passivity. It is a precision instrument for locating exactly where effort is worth making. If what is truly up to us is our judgments and our assents, then the most important work a person can do is the work of governing those, of learning to see impressions clearly, of learning to withhold assent from impressions that do not deserve it, of learning to hold the threshold between impression and response as a place worth standing in before moving through. The distinction between what is and is not up to us becomes, in practice, a map of the interior, and the space between stimulus and response is where the map points. Epictetus had known what it was to have almost nothing outside that space be up to him. He had been enslaved. The details of his early life, before the teaching room in Nicopolis, and the students who came from across the Roman world to hear him, include the physical fact of belonging entirely to another person's legal authority. What he could not be compelled to surrender, he had argued with philosophical precision and with the evidence of his own life, were his judgments, his assents, the quality of his proharis, his moral choice, the deep interior activity of deciding what to value and how to orient the will in response to what the world presented. These had remained his, and in remaining his, They had been enough. When he described the space between stimulus and response to his students, he was not describing a luxury available only to those with comfortable circumstances. He was describing what it held in the most demanding possible test of the theory, not as a comfort, exactly, as a fact. The space had been there. He had found it. He had used it. This is worth holding alongside the elegance of the philosophical argument. The argument did not only work on paper, it had been lived in conditions where it would have been perfectly understandable if it had simply broken down. There is a way of understanding the Stoic pause that makes it sound like a kind of restraint, a holding back, a suppression, a refusal of what the emotions are pressing for. This is not quite right, and Epictetus in particular would have been impatient with the misunderstanding. Withholding assent from an impression is not the suppression of a feeling. It is the refusal to treat a raw appearance as a settled truth before it has been examined. The anger or the fear or the grief is not being pushed down. The judgment that the anger is entirely appropriate, that the threat is exactly as threatening as it appears, that the loss is as catastrophic as the first impression of it suggests, that judgment is being held at a distance long enough for reason to look at it carefully. The feeling is allowed. What is interrogated is the belief. Chrysippus had been precise about this. He had argued that the passions, the pathe, the disturbing and excessive emotional states that the Stoics considered forms of cognitive error were not feelings in the modern sense, not raw physical states that arrive unbidden and must be endured or suppressed. They were judgments, mistaken judgments, but judgments nonetheless. The anger that becomes consuming and destructive is consuming and destructive because it rests on a false belief about the genuine importance of whatever has been lost or damaged. The grief that becomes debilitating rests on an overvaluation of what is not truly in our power to hold. These are not simply emotional weather, they are positions the mind has taken, and because they are positions, they can, in principle, be revised. What this means, practically, is that the pause between impression and response is not a pause in which nothing happens. It is a pause in which the most important thing happens. The impression is examined. The judgment embedded in the emotional response is identified. The question is asked, not as an accusation, but as a genuine inquiry, whether the belief driving the response is one that reason can endorse. Sometimes it can. Sometimes the anger is proportionate, the assessment accurate, the response that presents itself worth choosing. The Stoics were not arguing for the elimination of all response, or for a kind of affectless, philosophical detachment from everything that happens. They were arguing for examined response, response that has passed through the threshold rather than bypassed it. The pause is where examination happens, and examination for the Stoics was never cold or mechanical. It was the work of the logos, the rational principle, that the Stoics understood as both the structure of the cosmos and the specific quality of mind that makes human beings capable of something other than immediate reaction. When a person pauses before responding, standing in the space between what has arrived and what will be chosen, they are, in the Stoic account, using precisely the faculty that makes human life philosophically distinct. Not the most powerful animal, not the most durable, but the one capable of this, of standing in the threshold and asking what is actually true and what response actually serves. Viktor Frankl had not read Chrysippus when the world he had built was taken from him. He had not been sitting with the Meditations when he arrived at Auschwitz in 1944 and understood in those first days of an experience that most people did not survive, that everything external to his own responses had been removed from his control. He had been reading other things, Freud, Adler, the clinical literature of Viennese psychiatry, the early work that would eventually become logotherapy. But what he arrived at, through years of enforced reflection in conditions that reduced everything inessential to nothing, was a description of something that the Stoics would have recognized immediately. He described it later, after the liberation, after the long process of returning to a world that was also, in various ways, not quite the world he had left, as a space, not a technique, not a discipline, a space between what was done to him and what he chose to do next. He had found, or had built, or had simply noticed that it had always been there, a gap, an interval, a moment that was entirely his own, regardless of what surrounded it. In that space, he said, lay human freedom. The freedom was not large. It was not comfortable. It did not remove the suffering or restore what had been destroyed. But it was real, and it was his, and in holding it he had remained, in whatever sense mattered most, himself. What Frankl described from within an extreme modern experience was not identical to what Epictetus had described from within the experience of enslavement in the Roman Empire. The philosophical frameworks were different. The cosmologies were different. The cultural languages through which each man had learned to think about what was happening to him were separated by centuries and by the enormous distance between ancient Stoic philosophy and 20th century existential psychology. But the space they were describing was the same space. The gap between stimulus and response, the interval in which a person remains the author of their own choices, rather than only the subject of what is done to them. This had been found, independently and under different names, by people working in entirely different traditions, and had been found to be real. This convergence across different philosophical languages is not evidence that there is one single truth being approached from multiple directions. The traditions are genuinely different in their deeper commitments. It is evidence of something simpler, that the space is actually there, that it can be found, and that people who look carefully and honestly for it tend to find it in approximately the same location. The threshold between what arrives and what is chosen, the moment before ascent, has moved toward the impression and made it into a belief that drives action. To find the space is not the same as to have always lived in it. This deserves to be said plainly, because there is a version of this philosophy that implies a kind of achieved stillness, a philosopher so thoroughly trained that the threshold is always inhabited, that no impression ever moves directly to action without examination, that the space between stimulus and response has been permanently widened through practice until it is always there, always available, always sufficient. That version is probably not quite real, or is real only rarely and incompletely. What is real is the practice, the repeated return to the question of whether the impression has been examined, the daily effort to widen the gap slightly more than the day before, the willingness to ask at the end of a day, in the lamplight of whatever quiet the day has left, whether the threshold was used. Marcus Aurelius was asking this question in military quarters, along a cold river, while governing an empire and managing a plague, and presiding over a philosophical tradition he found genuinely important and genuinely difficult to live by. He was not serene in the way a person who has transcended difficulty is serene. He was composed in the way a person who has chosen composure, repeatedly and not always successfully, eventually becomes composed, not because the difficulty has been removed, but because the practice of returning to the threshold has become more reliable than the habit of bypassing it. The private journal is the practice made visible. Every sentence he wrote to himself was the practice. The asking of the question, did I test that impression, was itself the practice. the returning to the page when the answer was no, when the day had included moments of reactive anger or clouded judgment, or responses that had moved from impression to action without pausing at the threshold, that returning was the practice, not the achievement, the practice. And the practice, understood correctly, does not have an end point. It is only continuation. Epictetus had been explicit about this with his students in Nicopolis. The work of philosophy, what he called, in terms that would have surprised a modern listener expecting something more abstract, a kind of training, was continuous, not concentrated into particular moments of reflection, not reserved for crises when the need for composure was obvious, continuous. From the moment of waking, the impressions were arriving, and from the moment of waking, the question applied, is this what it appears to be? Every appearance needed to be met with that question, not because every appearance would prove deceptive or misleading, but because the habit of examining, of standing for a moment in the threshold, rather than bypassing it, could only become reliable if it were practiced on everything, not only on the things that obviously required it. A student who practiced this only when provoked would discover that when provocation arrived, the habit of examination was not yet reliable enough to engage in time. By the moment when the impression was most pressing and the impulse toward immediate response was strongest, the threshold needed to be already familiar territory. It needed to have been visited enough times in ordinary moments when the stakes were low that stepping into it in a difficult moment was the same movement, the same familiar interior turn, only this time with more weight on the other side. This is what the Stoic understanding of the pause as a practice, rather than as a natural capacity that needs only to be invoked, actually means. The threshold is always there in principle. Structurally, the gap between impression and assent is always present, always the same kind of event, in the same kind of architecture. But whether it can be found and inhabited in the moment when it matters most depends on whether it has been practiced in the moments when it matters less. The structure is given, the access to the structure is built. There is something quietly generous in this account when it is held for a moment. The Stoics did not argue that some people were naturally equipped with wider thresholds and others condemned to narrower ones. They did not argue that philosophical training was a luxury of the educated or the privileged. Epictetus had taught the sons of Roman senators, and he had himself been enslaved, and his position was that the threshold was equally available to both, and that what differed was practice, not endowment. The emperor and the slave had the same structure of mind. What each had done with it, how much each had practiced standing in the threshold, how reliably each could find it when it mattered, that was the variable. And the variable was always, in principle, adjustable. The impression arrives, and for a moment it is only what it is, unexamined, unlabeled, not yet the belief it is about to become. The fantasia rests in its own first form, not yet urgent, not yet categorized as threat, or loss, or insult, or injustice. Still, only the raw presentation of something having arrived. In that moment, brief, available, always present, the Stoic philosophy locates the point where a human life can be, in the most literal sense, governed rather than merely lived through. Governed is a word Marcus Aurelius would have understood in its fullest range. He governed an empire. He also, in those nighttime sentences, governed himself, or tried to, with the daily honesty of a person who knew the difference between trying and succeeding, and who had decided that trying again tomorrow was the only philosophically adequate response to falling short today. The two kinds of governance were connected in his mind. A person who could not govern the movement from impression to response in their own interior life, had no reliable foundation for governing anything outside it. The quality of a decision made in the heat of an initial impression, before the space had been entered, before the examination had occurred, was the quality of an ungoverned mind, wearing the appearance of authority. And authority, in the Stoic view, was only as good as the self-governance beneath it. This is not a political argument, or not primarily. It is a description of what it is actually like to be a person whose responses have been examined rather than merely felt, the specific quality of a life lived with some consistency in the threshold rather than mostly on either side of it. It is quieter, not less engaged with the world, but differently engaged from a slightly greater depth, from a position that has taken one breath before speaking, that has asked one question before moving, that has stood for one moment in the space between impression and assent, and found in that standing something that cannot be found anywhere else. What the standing produces is not certainty. The Stoics were not arguing that philosophical training guaranteed correct responses. They were arguing that examined responses were more likely to be proportionate, more likely to serve what the person genuinely valued, more likely to be ones that could be returned to at the end of the day, without the kind of regret that comes from having bypassed the threshold entirely. Not perfect, better, more reliably one's own. The lamp in the military tent along the Danube is burning low by now. Marcus has been writing for some time. The sentences he is composing have a particular quality, not the polished rhetoric of a public document, not the careful argumentation of a philosophical treatise meant to be read and debated, but the quietly laboring prose of a man working something out for himself, in real time, in the honest and private language of a journal that will not be read until he is gone, and perhaps not even then. He is asking himself whether the space was used well today. He is noting where it was not. He is committing, in words that only he will read, to returning to it tomorrow. And in the returning, in the daily commitment to finding the threshold again, to practicing the examination again, to standing in the gap between impression and assent with the same patient attention that has been brought to it on all the previous nights, something accumulates, not a mastery that is ever finished, not an immunity to being moved by what arrives, something quieter than either of those, a growing familiarity with the interior territory, a deepening knowledge of where the threshold is and how it feels to stand in it, a gradual settling of the practice into something that begins to feel less like effort and more like recognition. The room has always been there. This is what the practice over time reveals. The space between stimulus and response, the interval where Frankl found freedom, where Epictetus found the boundary of what could be owned, where Marcus returned in his private sentences to recalibrate what the day had moved, has not been built through the practice. It was already present in the structure of how a mind and a world encounter each other. What the practice builds is only the access, the familiarity, the reliable knowledge of where to stand when standing there is what is needed. The impression arrives in the night, some distant sound, some memory, some thought that forms in the particular way. Thoughts form in the hours before sleep, and before it has become anything definite, before it has gathered into belief or impulse or concern, it rests for a moment in its own first form, unexamined, open, not yet committed to being anything particular. And in that moment before commitment, the same space is present that was present for Marcus in the lamplight, for Epictetus in the teaching room, for Frankl in the years of enforced reflection, the same threshold, available in the same way, waiting in its own quiet and unhurried manner for whoever has learned to find it, not a skill still to be acquired, not a practice requiring more years of training before it becomes available. The room was always there, the door was always in the same place. What happens with patience, with the daily return to the question, with the accumulated practice of standing in the threshold, in the small moments and the larger ones? What happens is simply that the door becomes easier to find, and standing in it becomes over time the most natural thing in the world, like arriving home to a place where everything is already familiar and the light is always on. The night continues, the lamp burns. The threshold waits in its usual location, neither demanding nor withholding, simply present in the architecture of every moment that has ever included an impression and a response, which is every moment, without exception, that a person has ever been alive in the world. Seneca was dictating, not reading aloud, not thinking through a draft, dictating, slowly, with the particular care of a man who has chosen each word before it leaves his mouth, in the way a physician selects an instrument before the hand moves. The letter was addressed to his brother Novatus, and it concerned anger. It concerned anger, not as a confession, not as an apology for something recently done, but as a subject that deserved the same scrutiny a geographer might give a dangerous piece of terrain, patient, precise, interested in the shape of the thing rather than afraid of it. The year was somewhere around 49 CE. The room was private. Outside it, Rome moved with all its noise and pressure and provocation. Inside it, one man spoke carefully into the air, and a hand wrote down what he said, and the subject of what he said was the fire that had burned through more Roman lives than any plague, the passion that the Roman world had, in many quarters, come to mistake for virtue, for dignity, for righteous power exercised by those strong enough to enforce their will. Seneca had watched it. He had watched it in the Senate, in the courts, in the private rooms of powerful men who had reduced themselves in a moment from figures of authority into figures of appetite. He had watched it, if he was honest, and De Ira is, above all else, an honest document in himself. What he wanted to give Novatus was not permission to remain angry, and not a technique for disguising it, but something older and more useful, a way of seeing it clearly enough that the seeing itself became a form of distance. The argument he would make was direct and did not flinch from its own implications. Anger, Seneca held, was never useful, not even as a tool of correction, not even when the wrong was real and the injury was genuine, not even when every social convention of his world would have recognized the anger as justified and its expression as appropriate. The anger was always a mark of weakness rather than strength, always a proof that the thing which had arrived from outside had been allowed to enter and govern what should have been ungovernable. The interior territory where judgment lives, where response is chosen rather than merely happened. This was not an easy claim to make in Rome. The Roman cultural inheritance included righteous anger as one of the virtues of the powerful. To be provoked and to respond with force was in many of the frameworks Seneca's audience had grown up inside, the mark of a man who understood his own dignity. Seneca's argument was that this entire tradition had confused strength with capitulation. A man who strikes back when struck has allowed the one who struck him to determine what he will do next. The man who pauses, who does not respond with the heat that has arrived in him, who looks at the provocation and chooses, that man has not surrendered his authority. He has kept it. The opening of Didira has the quality of a physician speaking carefully into the air, the choice of every word deliberate, and this lexical precision was not accidental, was not stylistic preference. It was itself a philosophical argument. Seneca would call anger weakness, not passion. Not because the distinction was technical, but because the word you choose to describe a thing changes what you believe about it. Passion suggests something large and perhaps noble, something that arrives unbidden from the depths of a person's nature and therefore carries a certain authority. Weakness suggests something that happens to a person in the absence of sufficient governance, something that diminishes rather than ennobles. Name the thing correctly, Seneca understood, and the relationship to it shifts before any other work has been done. The naming was already the beginning of the cure. The first thing De Hira asks a reader to do, then, is see, not to stop feeling, not to suppress, not to perform a calmer self than the one available, but to look at anger with enough precision to see what it actually is, at the level where it can most clearly be known. What it is at that level is a sequence. This is one of the foundational Stoic psychological insights, and Seneca gives it its fullest expression in De Ira, though its roots reach back further to the Stoic teacher Chrysippus, who had worked through the precise logical mechanics of passion in Athens several centuries before Seneca composed his letter. The insight is this: no impulse arises without a preceding impression. None. Not a twitch, not a shout, not an action taken in what is usually called the heat of the moment without having passed, however briefly and invisibly, through a chain of internal events. What feels like compulsion, what feels from the inside like a response that simply happened, that bypassed all volition, is not a bypass. It is speed. It is the chain moving so quickly that awareness cannot catch it, and because it cannot catch it, it mistakes the speed for inevitability. Slow the chain down, make it visible, and what had appeared to be a single event, the provocation received, the response delivered, separates into its parts, and between the parts, something is discovered that was always there. The gap, the interval, the interior distance between what arrived and what was chosen. Chrysippus had worked through the logical architecture of this with the care of a man building a proof. The argument that he wanted to establish, and that Seneca would later turn into a therapeutic program, was that every passion is at its foundation a false judgment, not a feeling, or not only a feeling, but a cognitive act, a belief about the genuine value of the thing that has provoked the response. The person who flies into rage when insulted is not simply responding with uncontrollable biological urgency. They are making a claim, silently and rapidly, and without examining it, about the genuine importance of the insult, about its power to damage something that truly matters, about what the correct response to a genuine damage of that kind would be. They are, in the Stoic understanding, arguing, and because they are arguing, they can, in principle, be answered with better arguments. This was what Chrysippus meant by calling passion a form of cognitive error. Not that strong feeling is a mistake, not that the person experiencing grief or rage has failed some intellectual test. The Stoics held a careful distinction here, one that Seneca would draw on throughout De Ira. There were responses to the world that were involuntary, physical, entirely beyond the reach of philosophy, and there was no shame in them and no cure available for them, because none was needed. And there were responses that had passed through assent, that had been amplified by a judgment that confirmed and entrenched them, and those were what required the Stoics' attention. The first category the Stoics called propotheia. These were the preliminary movements of the body and the nervous system, the flinch before the loud sound, the flush that rises in the cheek when something humiliating is witnessed, the trembling that arrives before a difficult confrontation. These were not moral failures. They were not even in the strict Stoic sense passions at all. They were the organism's immediate, uncontrolled, philosophically irrelevant preparation for what it does not yet know. A Stoic did not expect these to be governed. A Stoic did not consider their presence proof of insufficient philosophy. The shudder that runs through a body in the first instant of an unexpected shock is no more a moral event than the pupil's response to sudden darkness. What came after, what arrived in the moment after the propathei had done their preliminary work, and before the full entrenched passion had settled in, that was where the entire weight of the Stoic analysis came to rest. In that second moment, something was available. Seneca describes this availability in De Ira not with clinical detachment, but with the particular warmth of a man who has found something in his own experience that he genuinely wants to pass on. He is not theorizing from a distance, he is reporting from the inside of a practice. Chorism. The second moment is the moment before the impression has been confirmed by assent, before the judgment has been made that the thing which arrived, the insult, the delay, the disrupted expectation, is genuinely the disaster it first presented itself as being. The impression is there. The initial heat is there. The propatheia have already moved through the body. But the full conviction, the settled belief that drives and sustains the full passion, has not yet solidified. There is, in that moment, a door. It does not stay open indefinitely. The Stoic account is honest about this. The window available for rational intervention narrows the longer the impression goes unchallenged. The longer the initial heat is allowed to feed on its own material, without the application of a cooler scrutiny. Seneca knew from experience, and from whatever he had read of Chrysippus's logical architecture, that the difference between the person who caught the impression at the second moment and the person who did not was not a difference in character or in native temperament, but a difference in practice, in how often and how consistently the gap between impression and assent had been visited, made familiar, learned as a place where a person could actually stand, rather than merely pass through on the way to the response that the impression seemed to demand. Practice was the word, not virtue as a fixed endowment, not wisdom as a gift that some possessed and others lacked. Practice, the daily, repeated, unglamorous discipline of catching the impression before assent, of standing in the gap long enough to ask whether the proposed response served reason or merely satisfied something that had mistaken its own urgency for necessity. The three-stage model is visible in De Ira with particular clarity when Seneca turns to the question of what anyone who is genuinely trying to govern their own reactions should actually do. He does not suggest they should attempt to prevent the propatheia, the first trembling, the first flush, the first shudder of the system responding to an impression before reason has been given time to arrive. Asking the Stoic practitioner to prevent those preliminary movements would be like asking them to stop the pupil of the eye from dilating in the dark. The body moves before philosophy can reach it, and philosophy makes its peace with this without regret. What Seneca does suggest, what he places at the center of De Rira as its most practical and most durable piece of advice, is delay, not distance, not the long philosophical project of reshaping an entire set of beliefs about what genuinely matters, though that project too has its place in the full Stoic curriculum. Delay, in the immediate, available, practical moment of the second stage, before full assent has been given, before the entrenched passion has settled in and begun to direct the hands and the mouth and the posture, simply do not yet act, do not yet speak, do not yet move toward the thing that the impression's heat is suggesting should happen. Wait. Seneca had a particular fondness for giving this advice in the plainest possible form. If someone has provoked anger, do not respond while in the grip of the initial heat. Go away from the room if that is available. Request more time. Ask to return to the question. Even the words "let me consider this," the direct statement of a willingness to pause rather than to immediately react, were in Seneca's account an act of courage and philosophical discipline rather than a sign of hesitation or weakness. The Roman world read delay as retreat. Seneca was arguing that delay was the first move of the genuinely strong. The reason delay works when it works is that impressions in their initial state are not stable. They do not maintain their original heat and authority without something feeding them. The propythei move through the body and subside. The flush does its work and passes. The trembling settles. The impression, given time and the absence of repeated confirmation, tends to cool at its edges, not necessarily to disappear, not to be replaced by indifference, but to become something that can be examined rather than merely obeyed. Seneca knew this from the inside. He had experienced the difference between the letter he would have sent in the first hour after an insult, when the heat of the impression was still at its peak, and everything in him was organized around confirming that the insult was the damage it had presented itself as being, and the letter he sent the following day, when the initial heat had passed and what remained was something more honest, a clearer view of both the injury and the proportionate response to it. The letter composed in the first hour would have served the impression. The letter composed the following day served something else, something that remained after the impression's heat had been allowed to do its preliminary work and then cool. Seneca would not have said this was a letter composed by a different person. He would have said it was a letter composed by the same person with more of their rational faculty available, because the rational faculty had not been overwhelmed by the speed and heat of an impression that had not yet been questioned. There is a detail in De Ira that returns to mind with particular force when the full scope of Seneca's therapeutic program is being considered. At one point he recommends asking, when in the grip of an initial provocation, whether the person who provoked the anger is someone worth the cost of the anger itself, not whether the anger is justified, not whether the wrong was real, but whether the person who provoked it is worth handing over the governance of one's own interior state, which is what anger always involves, a surrender of the interior to whatever has arrived from outside. The question reframes everything, not "was I wronged?" A question whose answer rarely moves toward calm, but is what I am about to do my own choosing, or is it the provocation doing its work on me? The first question keeps the attention fixed on the event that has already happened. The second question returns the attention to the only place where anything can be governed, the threshold, the gap, the interval between the impression received and the response determined. Chrysippus had built the logical case for this reframing. Seneca turned the logical case into a letter. The movement from logical architecture to therapeutic practice was not a simplification. It was a recognition that the philosophical argument, however sound, would remain inert unless it was given a form that a person could actually carry into their ordinary days and ordinary provocations. The words spoken poorly, the plan disrupted, the slight received in a room full of people who noticed it. The false judgment at the root of anger in the Stoic account is always fundamentally the same judgment, that the thing which has provoked the anger is genuinely and significantly damaging to something that truly matters. The insult matters because reputation matters. The delay matters because time matters. The disruption matters because the plan mattered. And in each case, the Stoic analysis says, look again at what is being called essential. Not to dismiss the loss, not to deny that something real has been touched, but to ask honestly whether the thing being defended, the reputation, the timetable, the plan, belongs to the category of things that are genuinely within one's power and therefore genuinely worth defending, or whether it belongs to the category of things that were always outside it, always subject to the world's interference, always insufficient as grounds for surrendering the interior territory. This is where the Stoic therapeutic meets its limit and also its depth. The limit is this: the correction of false judgment requires more than a brief delay. The instruction to pause before responding is the beginning of the practice, not its completion. Beneath the instruction is a much longer philosophical project, the genuine examination of what one has been treating as essential and whether it deserves that treatment. That project does not complete itself in an afternoon. It is the work of a philosophical life, the kind of work Seneca had been doing in various forms for decades before he sat down to dictate De Urfa. But the depth is this: the brief delay is not a small thing in a large program. It is the thing that makes everything else possible. Without the pause, the long philosophical project never gets started, because the impressions keep arriving and being confirmed before they can be questioned, and the beliefs that make the impressions feel compelling keep accumulating, and what was once a tendency becomes, over time, something closer to a character, not fixed, not beyond reach, but deeper and less available for examination than it would have been if the pause had been practiced from the beginning. Seneca was making a case for starting now, not when the philosophy was more complete, not when a sufficient period of self-examination had produced a self that was harder to provoke, not when life had arranged itself into a configuration where the provocations were fewer and the opportunities for calm were greater. Now, in the next ordinary day, in the next ordinary hour, in the next moment when the impression arrives and the heat begins and the mouth opens or the hand reaches, now is when the pause is available, and now is when its practice begins to accumulate into something that has weight. This was Seneca's gift to Novatus, not the comfort that anger was natural and therefore forgivable, not the assurance that the impulses that moved through him were beyond his governance and therefore not his responsibility. The more difficult and more useful gift, the argument that the chain from impression to action, which had always moved too fast to be witnessed, could be slowed, not stopped, not replaced with a permanent serenity that no provocation could disturb, slowed, widened, made visible at the point where it had always been too fast to see, and in that visibility, the possibility of a choice. There is a particular image that belongs to this moment in Seneca's argument, not an image he himself uses in De Ira, but one that the argument generates almost of its own weight when followed far enough, the image of anger moving through a person in visible sequence, like water moving through a system that has been slowed enough to see each stage. The first stage, the physical shudder, the flush, the trembling that runs through the propathia and does its preliminary biological work and passes. The system has received something. Nothing morally significant has happened yet. The organism is preparing, as organisms do, for what is about to be determined. The second stage, the impression, fully arrived now, presenting itself in the mind with the authority of something that has not yet been questioned. Here is what has happened to you. Here is what it means. Here is what a person who understood their own dignity would do in response. The impression is making its case. Nothing has been decided. The impression is there, held in the air between arrival and ascent, and this is the moment, this precise moment, this second stage where the impression exists as impression rather than as settled conviction, that the Stoic philosophy has been pointing toward since before Seneca was born, since the time when the argument was first worked out in Athens, or in the careful logical labor of teachers who understood that the freedom they were describing was built into the structure of the mind itself and had been available there all along. The third stage: what happens after assent has been given or withheld? If it has been given, if the impression has been confirmed and the judgment made that yes, this thing is the damage it presented itself as being, yes, this wrong deserves the response that the heat of the initial impression suggested, then the full passion settles in. It takes up residence. It begins to amplify itself, to gather evidence from memory and anticipation that confirms its initial claim, to organize the body and the voice and the attention around the business of being legitimately, deeply, durably angry. This is the entrenched passion that Seneca describes in De Ira as the state most dangerous and most expensive to the person who inhabits it, not primarily because of what it will cause them to do to others, though that is also in Seneca's account, but because of what it does to the interior territory, to the ruling faculty, to the quality of a life lived from within a state that has made itself at home where judgment should be. If assent has been withheld, if the impression in its second stage has been met with the pause, with the delay, with the philosophical question that asks whether this is genuinely what it presents itself as being, and whether the proposed response is genuinely what reason would choose, then something different becomes possible. Not the elimination of feeling. The Stoics did not aim for a blank interior, and would not have recognized such a thing as philosophical progress. What becomes possible is the eupatheia, the well-reasoned emotional responses that remain proportionate, deliberate, aligned with what is genuinely at stake, rather than with what the initial heat insisted was at stake. The difference between raw anger and the Stoic equivalent is not the presence or absence of strong feeling. It is the relationship between the feeling and the judgment that sustains it. One is a feeling that has been confirmed without examination. The other is a response that has been examined and found proportionate. Seneca wanted Novatus to understand this distinction, not as a philosophical fine point, but as something with practical weight, something that could actually be used on ordinary days when ordinary things went wrong. The distinction between the passion and the eupatheia is not visible from the outside. The person practicing the pause may look, to an observer, very much like the person who has simply suppressed their anger and is holding it behind a composed face. But from the inside, the difference is the whole difference between governing and being governed, between choosing and being chosen for. The governing faculty, what the Stoics called the hegemonikon, the ruling part of the soul, was not, in Seneca's account, something abstract or remote. It was the thing that was functioning or failing in every moment of every day, in every response to every impression that arrived. Its quality determined not just the moral character of individual actions, but the texture of the entire life that those actions composed. A ruling faculty that had been trained through the practice of delay and the correction of false judgment to stand in the second stage long enough to ask whether the impression was what it claimed to be. Such a faculty produced, over time, a certain quality of life. Not a comfortable one, necessarily, not a life exempt from provocation or loss or genuine wrong, but a life in which those things, when they arrived, did not find an unguarded threshold. Seneca himself did not claim to have completed this project. De Ira does not read like the testimony of someone who has arrived at perfect governance of their own interior life. It reads like something more honest than that, the letter of a person who has thought carefully about what the practice requires, who has experienced both its failures and its partial successes, and who wants to pass on not the achievement, but the direction. The direction was toward the threshold, toward the moment of the second stage. toward the gap between impression and assent, where the chain could be made visible and the choice could be made available. Not later, not after further preparation, not when the philosophy had been more completely absorbed. Now, in the next moment that required it, with whatever degree of the practice was currently available. There is, in Seneca's account, something that might be called the economy of the pause. Each time the chain is slowed and the impression is questioned, even if the questioning does not immediately produce a fully reasoned response, even if the delay is brief and imperfect and the passion arrives anyway, only slightly cooled, something is deposited. Some small additional familiarity with the threshold is accumulated. The next time the chain moves, the threshold is slightly more visible, slightly less quickly passed through. The practice is not a project with a fixed completion point. It is a deposit made each time the pause is attempted, and the deposits accumulate slowly, without drama, into a familiarity with the interior that gradually changes what is possible there. Chrysippus had understood this in terms of the philosophical argument, that every passion is an argument, and that arguments, once examined, are available to be answered. Seneca had understood it in terms of the practical life of a person moving through a world that never stopped offering provocations. The meeting point of the two understandings was the pause, the breath taken, the sentence held, the moment in which neither the body nor the voice moved toward the response that the impression had suggested, while something quieter and more deliberate considered whether there was a better choice available. Seneca finished dictating. Outside his room, Rome continued. The Senate met. Insults were exchanged across the floors of public spaces. Men who had been building careful political reputations for years destroyed them in moments of unchecked anger that felt, in the moment of their delivery, like strength and dignity and righteous force. The Propotheia ran through bodies in their preliminary biological work. The impressions arrived, and the second stage came and went too quickly to be noticed, and the full passion settled in with the comfortable authority of things that had never been questioned, and therefore felt like facts about the world, rather than judgments made in the absence of scrutiny. In his private room, one man had written down the argument for why it did not have to go that way. The argument was not complicated. The chain from impression to action moves, and if it moves at its natural speed, without interference, without the practice of the pause inserting itself at the second stage, then the passion follows inevitably, and the response that follows the passion carries all the authority and all the cost of the passion itself. This was not fate. This was speed. It had always been speed. The chain had always had a second stage, and the second stage had always contained a door, and the door had always opened from the inside. What Seneca was handing Novatus across the pages of a letter that would eventually outlast every political and legal structure of the Rome they both inhabited was the key to a door he had always, without knowing it, been holding. A breath taken where no breath seemed called for. A hand that has not yet moved, resting quietly against itself, in no hurry. A sentence that has formed behind the lips, but has not yet been released into the air, where it would become something that could not be taken back. These are the small forms of the practice, not dramatic, not visible from outside, not impressive in any of the ways that Roman culture measured impressiveness. But in the Stoic account, they are the practice. They are the philosophy made actual. They are the ancient wisdom of the threshold, arrived at and used in the middle of an ordinary afternoon by a person who had learned, through whatever combination of reading and reflection and repeated imperfect trying, that the gap between what arrives and what is chosen is not a modern discovery and not a luxury available only in moments of calm. It is built into the structure of the mind. It has been there as long as minds have been there. It is available in every moment that contains both a provocation and a person who has at least briefly, at least once, at least imperfectly, learned to pause before the heat of the impression reaches the hands, a breath taken, a pause held open, a sentence resting, still and quiet, behind lips that have not yet decided to part. And in that stillness, something that is not the silence before a storm, but the silence of a person who has learned, by slow and honest accumulation, that the first breath after a provocation is always enough, and that what follows from that breath belongs to them. Pierre Hadot was sitting in a library in Paris in the early 1950s, a young scholar surrounded by the particular quiet that old books produce when enough of them are gathered in one place, when he turned a page in a translation of Epictetus and encountered a single Greek word that stopped him. He had been reading philosophy for years. He had moved through the great systems with the careful, practiced attention of someone trained to follow arguments wherever they went. But this word held him in a way that argument alone had not, because it was not pointing toward a conclusion. It was pointing toward a practice, toward something that happened, not in the study, but in the middle of every ordinary hour, of every ordinary day. The word was prosochi, and in the moment Hadot held it, he understood that what he was reading was not a document from a distant world. It was a description of something that had always been possible, and that most people had always neglected, and that the Stoics had, with characteristic precision, named prosoche. The word moves through ancient Stoic texts as quietly as breath, rarely announced, rarely defined, simply assumed, the way a particular quality of attention is assumed by those who have already committed to it. Hadot would spend the next several decades writing about it, returning to it, holding it up against other traditions to see what it shared and what it kept entirely its own. He came to understand it as perhaps the single most fundamental practice in the entire Stoic inheritance, not one discipline among others, the ground from which every other Stoic discipline grew. Without it, the philosophical arguments remained arguments, precise, admirable, inert. With it, philosophy became what the Stoics had always insisted it was, not a subject to be studied, but a way of inhabiting a life. The practice itself, described plainly, is this. In every waking moment, a practitioner of prosoche maintains a gentle, unwavering attention directed at the interior, at the impressions arriving, the impulses forming, the judgments beginning to take shape before they have hardened into belief or action, not scrutiny in the anxious sense, not surveillance, something closer to the quality of attention a careful listener brings to a conversation, present, unhurried, following what is actually happening rather than what they expect or fear. Epictetus described this as the most essential task a philosophical student could undertake. Before learning how to argue, before learning how to endure, a student needed to learn how to see themselves in the act of living. Not from memory, not in retrospect, but in the moving present, in the thin continuous margin between what arrives from the world and what moves out from the self in response. There is a kind of looking that disturbs what it looks at. The moment awareness turns inward, with judgment already loaded, with a verdict already forming, the inner life contracts around the inspection, and the seeing is already false. Prosoche was not this kind of looking. What Hadot recognized in Epictetus, and what he spent years trying to articulate to readers who had not yet encountered it, was that the Stoic self-attention was constitutionally different from self-criticism or self-punishment. It was observational, in the way good science is observational, genuinely interested in what is there, willing to find what is actually present rather than confirming what was already expected. The Stoics did not direct students to watch themselves in order to find failures. They directed students to watch themselves in order to find what was already happening, because what was already happening was the only material out of which a different kind of life could be made. Epictetus began his teaching days in Nicopolis this way, not with a text, not with an argument. He would sometimes begin with a question directed at a student: what had happened that morning, and had the student noticed the moment before they had decided how to feel about it? The question sounds simple. In the silence that followed it, the question revealed itself as something else entirely. Most people, confronted with such a question, discovered that they had not noticed, not because they were inattentive or careless, but because no one had told them there was something to notice. The morning had simply happened. The feelings had simply arrived. The responses had simply occurred. And between the arriving and the occurring, there had been what exactly? A gap, a space. Something that, under Epictetus's patient attention, began to reveal itself as a space in which a great deal had already been decided, silently, automatically, without anyone in authority having given the order. This was what Prosoch was designed to illuminate, not the dramatic moments of crisis or high moral pressure, when attention naturally sharpens and the stakes declare themselves. Those moments tend to demand the attention they receive. Epictetus was interested in the ordinary hours, the conversations that barely registered, the minor irritations that came and went before they had been examined, the small impressions that settled into the mind and became without ceremony the premises from which behavior grew. He taught that the untrained mind moves through these hours in a kind of philosophical sleep, responsive, engaged, even energetic, but not yet awake to the layer of activity just below the surface, where impressions are being received and sorted and acted upon by a process that has never been asked to account for itself. Prosoche was the practice of waking that deeper layer up, gently, incrementally, without alarm. In the Enchiridion, his student Arrian's careful record of his core teaching, Epictetus returned again and again to a single fundamental instruction. At every moment, before every response, ask of the impression presenting itself, are you what you appear to be? Not as a formula, not as a ritual phrase, as a genuine question, requiring a genuine pause. The impression says, this is insulting. Ask whether it is. The impression says, this is dangerous. Ask whether it is. The impression says, this demands an immediate response. Ask whether it does. None of these questions are posed in hostility to the impression or in denial of it. They are posed in the spirit of a fair-minded investigator who understands that the first report of a thing is rarely the whole report, and who has learned through enough experience that the quality of the response depends almost entirely on the quality of the examination that preceded it. The philosophical challenge directed at each impression, are you what you appear to be, was not, in Epictetus's teaching, an occasional intervention for moments of visible crisis. It was a training of the entire perceptual apparatus, extended without break across every waking hour. This is what distinguished Prosoch from what might now be called periodic reflection or structured review. The Stoic practice did not wait for an appropriate moment. It ran continuously beneath every activity, like a low, reliable light that neither demands attention nor withdraws it. A student practicing Prosoch during a walk through the market was as engaged with the practice as a student seated in the teaching room working through a formal argument. The market, with its press of sensations and transactions and opportunities for irritation or desire, was in some respects the better classroom. The testing of impressions in conditions of ordinary life was precisely where the practice either held or failed. Marcus Aurelius knew this. The 12 books of the Meditations are, among other things, a record of what happens when a person of serious philosophical intention tries to maintain prosody across a life of almost unrelenting practical demand. He ruled for nearly 20 years. There were wars along the Danube frontier, a devastating plague that moved through the empire and did not leave, political betrayals of a kind that would have justified bitterness in a lesser character, and the ordinary unremitting weight of administrative governance over the largest political entity the ancient world had produced. In the middle of all of this, he found time, not much time, and perhaps not always enough, to sit with a stylus and a notebook and ask himself in writing whether he had watched himself well enough that day, whether he had noticed the impressions before they became convictions, whether he had, when the heat of a difficult moment had arrived, given himself enough space to ask the question before he had answered it with action. He was following a tradition older than his own Stoic teachers. The practice of nightly self-examination had been attributed to Pythagoras in antiquity, and Seneca described practicing it himself in a passage from his letters that reads with surprising intimacy, the way a person might write at the end of a long day, when what they are writing is not for an audience, but for themselves, for the part of the self that wants to understand what the day had actually been. Seneca's version involved sitting quietly each evening and passing the events of the day through a set of quiet questions. What had disturbed him, and had the disturbance been warranted? And what had he done that he wished he had done differently? And what was the difference between what he had done and what a well-ordered mind would have done instead? The questions were not punitive. They were the questions of an honest investigator who has agreed in advance that what they find will be welcome whatever it is, because understanding is always more useful than ignorance, even when what is understood requires acknowledgement of error. Marcus Aurelius's nightly writing was this practice extended into a discipline of unusual rigor and unusual intimacy. The Meditations were not written for an audience, but they contain no argument directed at a reader, no rhetorical structure designed to persuade, no careful arrangement of material toward a public effect. They were written to himself by himself, for the purpose of recalibrating what Epictetus had called prohairesis, the ruling capacity of moral choice, so that it was aligned before sleep with what reason and philosophy required, rather than what the pressures of the day had bent it toward. He wrote reminders, he wrote corrections, he wrote sometimes the same point he had written before, because it was a point he kept needing to return to, and the returning was itself evidence that the work was genuine. He was practicing prosody in retrospect, in writing, as a way of making the continuous practice more reliable in the hours that followed. Pierre Hadot, reading these documents across decades of sustained engagement, found in them a quality that formal philosophical argument rarely achieves. The texts were alive in a way that treatises are not because they were passionate or dramatic. They are, characteristically, neither, but because they were genuinely working. The arguments in them were not being marshaled for display. They were being used in real time by someone who needed them. Hadot came to describe the Stoic practices he had identified, prosocia among them, and the nightly examination, and the philosophical challenge to impressions, as spiritual exercises, deliberately using a phrase that risked sounding like a category error, but was in fact precise. These were exercises in the same sense that physical training is exercise. Practices that change the practitioner not by conveying information, but by reshaping, through repetition, the trained capacity itself. A person who has done prosocia long enough does not need to remind themselves to notice their impressions. The noticing has become the texture of how they move through the world. Hadot was not the first to see connections between this quality of attention and practices that had developed independently in other traditions. Scholars of comparative philosophy working in his period and after had noted that what the Stoics called prosocia bore a structural resemblance to what Buddhist practitioners called sati, mindfulness, a word whose original meaning was something closer to attentive presence or clear remembering, in the sense of keeping one's awareness from wandering away from what was actually occurring. Both practices place the untrained, inattentive mind at the center of the diagnosis. Both practices identified the wandering of awareness, the tendency of the mind to move on autopilot through experience without genuinely witnessing what it was doing, as the primary source of unnecessary confusion and distress. Both practices offered continuous, gentle, non-punitive attention as the primary remedy. The resemblance held at the level of method. It did not hold at the level of ultimate aim, and the Stoics and Buddhists would have recognized each other's differences as clearly as their commonalities. For the Stoic, prosocia served the cultivation of logos, the rational faculty whose proper ordering was the whole of human virtue and the basis of human freedom. The attention was in service of reason, and reason was in service of a life aligned with the rational structure of the cosmos. For the Buddhist practitioner, sati served a different purpose, directed toward different ultimate understanding about the nature of self and suffering and liberation. The two paths arriving at the same gate walk through it toward different destinations. What they share is the gate and the particular quality of attention required to pass through it. That sharing is not nothing. Between traditions that developed without knowledge of each other, it suggests something about the nature of mind itself, that attentive witnessing, extended and sustained, is not a technique peculiar to any culture, but something available anywhere the human mind turns steadily toward its own operations. The convergence, held gently, without forcing either tradition to confirm the other, offers the practitioner of prosocia something useful. It suggests that the practice is not exotic. It is not a discovery of a particular school or a particular century. It is a rediscovery of something that seems to present itself again and again whenever a philosophical tradition looks honestly at the untrained mind and asks what would most reliably improve it. The answer, across very different cosmologies and very different understandings of the ultimate nature of things, has tended to be the same. Watch with patience, without alarm, not in order to judge, not in order to suppress, but in order to see, and then to find, in the seeing itself, a kind of governance that does not feel like governance because it has become as natural as breath. What the practice offers, once it has been sustained long enough to become genuine, is not the dramatic transformation that philosophical language sometimes promises. It is something quieter and in certain respects more useful. A practitioner of prosocia, moving through an ordinary afternoon, through a conversation that has become demanding, through a delay that has disrupted a plan, through an encounter with someone whose manner grates against their patience, does not experience the afternoon as a series of stimuli to be managed. The impressions arrive as they always arrive. The impulses form as they always form. But between the arriving and the forming, something is opened up, a kind of space, not manufactured, not forcibly inserted, simply uncovered, the way clearing away accumulated clutter uncovers the floor that was always there beneath it. The space was always there. Prosocia did not create it. Prosocia revealed it. Gradually, in the way that patient attention always eventually reveals what habit and speed had been concealing. And in that space, something shifts that is difficult to describe without either overclaiming it or understating it. It is not serenity in any theatrical sense. The afternoon is still demanding, the conversation is still difficult, the delay is still an inconvenience. What has changed is the relationship between the practitioner and these facts, because prosoche, sustained over time, has trained a capacity that might be called philosophical distance, not the cold distance of indifference, but the measured distance of someone who has learned that the first appearance of a thing is rarely its final and complete nature, and who has given themselves, by long practice, enough room to wait for more information before responding. The impressions are still felt. They are felt, in fact, with more precision and more clarity than they were before, because attention sharpens rather than numbs the perceptual field. What has changed is the automatic momentum from impression to response. That momentum has slowed, not to a stop, but to a pace at which the practitioner can be present in it, rather than simply carried by it. Epictetus described this as what distinguished the philosopher from the ordinary unreflective person. Not wisdom, not correct doctrine, not a superior set of beliefs. The distinction was entirely one of attention. The ordinary person, moving through the same afternoon, would experience the same impressions and be moved by them in the same way, more or less quickly, more or less forcefully, depending on temperament and circumstance. The philosopher had learned to notice the movement. The philosopher saw the impression arriving. The philosopher caught the impulse in its early formation, before it had gathered the force of unchallenged momentum, and in catching it, the philosopher was not obligated to do anything in particular with it, not to suppress it, not to override it, not to perform a dramatic act of self-governance that would advertise the philosophical discipline being exercised. The catching was enough. The catching was the practice. The catching, repeated across enough hours, across enough days, gradually changed the practitioner's relationship to their own inner life in a way that no single dramatic intervention could have achieved. There is a quality in the inner life of a person practicing prosoche that is hard to describe from the outside and easier to indicate through an image. Consider the difference between moving through a darkened house in which the lights have all been turned off, navigating by memory and by the particular sensitivity that darkness produces, and moving through the same house with the lights on low, not bright, not harsh, a low, steady, undisturbing light that reveals the furniture without dramatizing it. Everything that was there in the darkness is still there. The same rooms, the same arrangement, the same particular features of one's particular life. The low light does not change any of it. What it changes is the quality of the moving. Things are found without collision. The hand reaches for what it needs and finds it. Nothing emerges from the dark as a shock. The house is the same house. The moving is different. Prosoche was this quality of light, directed inward, not a harsh or scrutinizing illumination, not a light turned on to expose anything shameful or alarming, but a steady, gentle, uninterrupted brightness maintained throughout the day, so that nothing in the inner life, no impression, no impulse, no nascent judgment, arose entirely in the dark. Epictetus's great claim was not that the philosophical student would be free of difficult impressions, or that the practice would produce a life without friction. The claim was simpler and more sustainable. The student who had maintained prosoche throughout their day would not be surprised by themselves. They would not arrive at the end of a conversation having said something they had not chosen to say, or having responded to something in a way that, on reflection, had been driven by an impression they had never examined, not because they had been vigilant in any tense or exhausting sense, but because the light had been on. The nightly examination that Seneca practiced and Marcus Aurelius conducted in his private writing served a related but distinct function. Prosody was the continuous, moment-to-moment practice. The evening review was its retrospective complement, the careful, gentle accounting that took the accumulated events of the day and passed them through a patient scrutiny that the speed of living had not always permitted in the moment. Seneca's version, described in his letters with a warmth that the more formal philosophical texts rarely achieve, had the quality of a conversation between two parts of the same self, the part that had acted and the part that was now, in the relative stillness of the evening, able to ask whether the acting had been what it might have been. The question was never about punishment. It was about calibration, resetting the compass, as Marcus Aurelius did in his private notebooks, before surrender to sleep. Marcus Aurelius, at the end of a day of governing, set aside the instruments of imperial power and picked up the instrument of self-examination, the stylus, the page, the same disciplined attention that had managed courts and campaigns and the complex administrative machinery of an empire turned, in these private hours, toward the smaller and more intimate territory of his own day's choices. Had he noticed, when the frustration had arrived, what it actually was before he had let it shape a response? Had he given enough space before speaking for the impression to be examined rather than immediately confirmed? Had he, in the moments when the pressure of authority and circumstance had been greatest, maintained enough of the inner stillness that prosody cultivated to act from reason rather than from the momentum of the situation? He asked these questions not once, not on important days, but night after night after night, across 2 decades of sustained difficulty. And he asked them in the same spirit in which Epictetus had taught his students to direct the philosophical challenge at every impression, not with accusation, not with self-condemnation, but with the patient interest of someone who has agreed that what is found matters less than the quality of the looking. What Hadot found most striking across his decades of reading these texts was not the sophistication of the Stoic philosophical system. He was a scholar. The sophistication was familiar to him. What struck him was the insistence, running through every Stoic thinker he had studied, that the philosophy was useless if it remained in the study. Not merely less useful, useless. The argument could be understood perfectly. The logic could be followed without error. The categories of Stoic psychology could be memorized and recited, and none of it would make the slightest difference to the quality of a person's inner life, unless it had been taken into the continuous practice of self-attention, tested against actual impressions arising in actual hours of actual living, and refined through the nightly examination into something that changed not just what a person believed, but how they encountered each moment of their day. This was what prosody was for, not philosophical competence, not the ability to pass a test, something far more modest and far more demanding, the gradual education of attention into a capacity that could function reliably and without drama in ordinary life. Encratia was the Stoic name for what this education, carried far enough, eventually produced. It is usually translated as self-mastery, and the translation is accurate, but it risks carrying a flavor that the original did not quite have. The mastery implied in Encratia was not the mastery of force, not the image of a will clamped down over unruly impulse in a state of permanent effortful suppression. It was something more like the mastery of deep familiarity. the way a skilled craftsman has mastered their material, not by overpowering it, but by knowing it so well, having worked with it through so many hours and so many varied conditions, that the material itself has become something they can read and respond to with the ease that only long acquaintance produces. Encratea was the fruit of prosophy in this sense. It was not what happened when a person tried very hard to control themselves. It was what happened when a person had been watching their own mind for long enough that the mind's operations had become genuinely known to them, and what is genuinely known no longer arrives as a surprise, and what no longer arrives as a surprise no longer has the power of the unexpected to compel behavior before choice has been given a chance. Epictetus taught this, but he also embodied it in a way that his students would not have been able to miss. He had been a slave. He had spent years in a condition in which the external markers of freedom, the freedom to move, to work where one chose, to hold property, to make decisions about the most basic conditions of one's life, were absent. And he had taught from within that condition that freedom of precisely the kind that mattered most was not only available to him, but was, in certain respects, demonstrated more purely by his situation than it could have been by any more comfortable life. The freedom he was pointing to was not freedom from difficulty or from constraint. It was the freedom that prosophy gradually opened up, the freedom of a person who, having learned to watch their own mind steadily and without alarm, had discovered that no external condition could reach the layer at which their genuine governance of themselves occurred. The impressions arrived, the impulses formed, the space between them remained his, and the space, tended carefully, was enough. This is what the practice ultimately teaches, not a doctrine, not a set of propositions to be accepted, or a system to be memorized. A practitioner of prosophy, moving through enough ordinary hours with a steady, undisturbing quality of attention directed at their own inner life, comes to something that might be called settled self-acquaintance. The philosopher in the teaching room, and the person in the market, and the ruler in the campaign tent, and the slave in the master's household, all of them practicing the continuous, patient, non-punitive, watching that Epictetus described, and that Hadot recognized across centuries as the same practice, all of them discovering, in their different circumstances and from their different starting places, the same thing. The mind, watched long enough, becomes familiar. The familiar no longer startles. What does not startle does not compel. And in the space that does not compel, a person finds themselves, quietly and without drama, already free. By the time prosophy has settled into a genuine practice, not a technique applied with effort, but a quality of presence maintained without strain, the way a musician maintains their awareness of the sound they are making without interrupting the playing, the inner life takes on a texture that is difficult to describe in language that has not been corrupted by overuse. It is not peace in any shallow sense. It is not the absence of difficulty or the numbing of response. The impressions are still felt, and felt clearly. The impulses still arise, and are recognized for what they are. What has changed is only the relationship between the practitioner and their own experience. That relationship has become one of genuine acquaintance rather than uncertain encounter. The inner life, watched and known, is no longer a territory through which one moves with one's guard up, prepared for the unexpected. It has become more like a room whose arrangement one knows without needing to look, where the furniture is, where the light falls, where the edges are that once caught the ankle in the dark. The encratea that Epictetus spoke of, and that his students worked toward, and that Marcus Aurelius cultivated in his private writing through 2 decades of difficult life, and that Hadot recognized in a library in Paris, When a single Greek word stopped him in his reading, this was not the result of any struggle. It was the natural stillness that arrived after enough honest watching, the kind of stillness that has no effort in it, because the effort has long since been converted, through the slow alchemy of practice, into something permanent and quiet, the kind of stillness that knows itself and is, in knowing itself, already at rest. On the Danube frontier, in the last decade of his life, Marcus Aurelius set down the day's dispatches and picked up something smaller. The tent was quiet in the way military camps go. Quiet late, not silent, but subdued, the sounds of horses and distant fires reduced to textures rather than events. He was in his 60s by then, aging under a weight of governance that had not relented since the year he was named emperor, and his hands, which had signed orders for armies and judgments for provinces, now held a wax tablet and a stylus. He opened the notebook. He began to write to himself, not to posterity, not to his generals or his counselors or the Senate in Rome waiting on his decisions. To himself, in the second person, the way a man sometimes speaks inwardly when he needs the voice to have a direction. Marcus, he wrote, you received this today, and you did not meet it as you should have. Or the thing that disturbed you this morning was not worth the disturbance. The tone was never harsh, but it was honest in the way that private things can be honest, because there was no audience to perform composure for, and no need to be seen managing well. He was simply a man at the end of a long day, turning the instruments of his attention inward, asking himself what kind of person he had been between waking and this moment of stillness, and whether that person had been the one he intended to be. What he left behind in those notebooks was not a treatise. It was something more intimate and more strange, a record of a man governing the largest empire the ancient Mediterranean world had known, and spending his private hours not on strategy or on legacy, but on the quality of his own pauses. He returned, night after night, to the same territory, the moment before a response, the gap between what had arrived and what had followed, the threshold where the Stoic philosophy he had studied since his teens either held or gave way. The meditations, as later readers called them, read less like philosophy and more like practice, the same lessons written dozens of times, from slightly different angles, the way a musician returns to the same passage until the hand knows it without being told. The campaign on the Danube was not a philosopher's circumstance. There were Germanic tribes pressing the northern frontier, plague moving through the legions, supply lines stretched across terrain that did not cooperate with Roman logistics. His co-emperor Lucius Verus had died years earlier, leaving Marcus as sole ruler over all of it, and the political situation in Rome carried its own separate weight. None of this in the pages of the Meditations becomes an occasion for complaint. What it becomes is material, the specific texture of a life in which the Stoic question must be answered not in a comfortable teaching room, but in conditions that offered every conceivable justification for reacting rather than pausing, for letting the heat of a moment carry a decision rather than waiting for the heat to pass. Ancient historians noted something in him that contemporaries found almost puzzling. When difficult news arrived, he did not respond immediately. When he was insulted or challenged or contradicted, there was a visible moment, something his advisors and his enemies both observed, a quality of stillness that preceded whatever came next. He had a habit, documented in the sources, of adjourning decisions, of saying, in various ways, not yet. Let me return to this when the impression has settled. Let the situation be what it is for a moment, before I decide what the situation requires of me. This was not indecision. The decisions that eventually emerged were clear, and by the accounts of those who watched him govern, consistently grounded. The pause was not absence. It was the place where Marcus Aurelius did his most careful work. He had learned this from books and from teachers, and then he had spent decades learning it again from experience, which teaches differently. Epictetus, whose lectures Marcus had read, though he had never met the man, had insisted that philosophy was not an intellectual achievement, but a practice, that knowing the arguments was the beginning, not the end, and that the work was the daily, unglamorous repetition of turning toward one's own impressions before assenting to them. Marcus had written this lesson to himself so many times in the Meditations that the repetition becomes its own kind of teaching. He knew the ideas, he wrote them again anyway, because the Stoic understanding of the mind was that knowledge alone does not close the gap between knowing and doing, only practice, repeated in the actual heat and noise of an actual life, accomplishes that. What he practiced, night after night, was the art of asking whether the response he had given that day had come from the ruling faculty of his own considered judgment, or whether it had been pulled out of him by the raw force of an impression before his reason had had time to arrive. The distinction mattered to him not as a philosophical nicety, but as the central question of what kind of person he was becoming. He understood that a person is not made by single choices, but by the accumulation of pauses taken or not taken, of moments where the ruling faculty was consulted or bypassed, and that the character formed by these accumulated moments was the only real legacy a person left, regardless of what else they built or governed or decided. The lamp in the tent would have burned for an hour or two. He would have written until the sentences found their stillness, until the day had been examined and set aside, and then he would have slept the sleep of someone who had done what could be done. In the morning, there would be dispatches and decisions and the ongoing difficult work of holding something vast together. But for this hour, there was only the page and the quiet and the ongoing stoic discipline of a man who believed that the quality of his pauses was the quality of his life. Gaius Cato, whom history remembered as Cato the Younger, to distinguish him from his great-grandfather, was famous in Rome for something that the Roman political culture of his time found genuinely unusual. He would not be moved, not by flattery, not by social pressure, not by the particular kind of theatrical fury that passed for authority in the Roman Senate. He lived from 95 to 46 BCE, through one of the most turbulent periods Roman politics had seen, and his Stoic convictions were not, for him, a private intellectual habit, but a public, visible orientation that his contemporaries could observe and test, and frequently attempt to crack. There is an account preserved in the ancient sources of Cato being struck in public, physically struck, during a political confrontation, and his response was to go still, not to counterstrike, not to thunder with the wounded dignity that Roman aristocratic culture would have fully permitted and even expected. He went still, and then he spoke, and what he said when he spoke was measured in a way that the blow itself had not been, and the composure that preceded his speech was more unsettling to those watching than anger would have been. He had chosen his response from a place of stillness, and the choice had been visible, and the visibility was its own kind of argument. This was not naturally easy for Cato. The ancient sources are careful about this, which is one of the things that makes them worth reading. He was not described as a placid man. He was described as someone who felt provocation acutely, and who had, through long practice and genuine philosophical conviction, developed the capacity to hold the feeling without being propelled by it. The pause was not absence of feeling. It was the space between feeling and action, cultivated deliberately exercised under conditions that were not comfortable, returned to even when it failed and had to be rebuilt. What the Stoic tradition admired in Cato was not that he had eliminated the human susceptibility to being stung. What it admired was that he had refused to treat being stung as a mandate. He understood, in the Stoic way, that the insult was one thing, and his response to the insult was another, and that the first was not entirely in his control, but the second entirely was. His composure in public became, over time, a form of political speech, not because he planned it strategically, but because the repeated practice of the pause had made it visible, legible, a quality that those who watched him could recognize as something other than calculation. It was the shape of a man who had spent years deciding before the moment arrived what kind of person he would be when it did. He died in Utica, in North Africa, in 46 BCE, having refused to accept Julius Caesar's pardon, which he understood as the acceptance of a power he believed illegitimate. The decision was made with the same quality of deliberateness that had characterized everything else, not in heat, not in theatrical defiance, but after reflection, from a position that his philosophical commitments had made available to him, and that he was unwilling to abandon even then. Whatever one makes of the choice itself, the manner of it was unmistakably Stoic, the pause taken, the judgment made, the response proportionate not to the emotion of the moment, but to the values he had spent a lifetime ordering. Epictetus was born into slavery somewhere around 50 CE and spent the first decades of his life as the property of a man in Rome. His physical freedom was not available to him. His movements were constrained. His labor was not his own. And it was from within these conditions that he became the philosopher who articulated, more precisely than anyone before or since, what the Stoic doctrine of inner freedom actually meant when tested against the most demanding possible circumstances. He taught for years after being freed, eventually settling in Nicopolis in northwestern Greece, where he ran a small school whose graduates went on to influence, among others, Marcus Aurelius. He taught without writing. Everything known of his lectures exists because one of his students wrote them down, the discourses and the enchiridion, records of a spoken philosophy, the philosophy of a man who had learned what he knew, not from libraries, but from decades of having no alternative but to find, within the only territory that remained entirely his own, the freedom the Stoics had always claimed was there. In the classroom at Nicopolis, he did not speak of his years in slavery with bitterness. This is one of the things the ancient sources preserve, and it is one of the things that is hardest to dismiss as rhetorical embellishment, because it appears too consistently and in too much detail to be a fiction. He spoke of those years as a kind of laboratory. He had been given, by circumstance rather than by choice, precisely the conditions under which the Stoic claim about inner freedom either proved itself or did not. His body had been owned. His judgments had not, and what he had discovered, in the long years when everything external was someone else's to command, was that the territory of prohairesis, of moral choice, of the governance of one's own assents and responses, was genuinely impenetrable by any external force, however large or legitimate or well-resourced. He told his students this, not as a boast but as a finding. He had run the experiment under conditions most of them would never encounter, and the result was consistent with what the theory predicted. The space between what happens and what one chooses to do about it had remained his, even when everything else had not. The slave who has ordered his inner life, he insisted, is freer than the emperor who is not, and he said this with the quiet authority of someone who had checked, who had stood inside the constraint and turned it slowly, looking for where the Stoic claim failed and had not found the failure. What he gave his students was not comfort. He was not a comfortable teacher. He challenged them in the first session, before they had settled into the role of passive recipients, by asking them what they actually wanted, and whether what they wanted was genuinely within their power. He was precise about the distinction between what was vehement, up to them, and what was not, and he was relentless about the practical consequences of confusing the two categories. Most human suffering, he argued, came from wanting control over things that were in principle not controllable, and from failing to attend properly to the one thing that was, his own life, as he told it, had been the demonstration. In the Enchiridion, the short handbook of Stoic practice that Arrian assembled from the lectures, the instruction was plain and repeated. Begin each day by identifying what is in your power and what is not. Practice this distinction in small things before the large ones arrive. When an impression comes that seems to demand immediate response, pause before assenting. Ask whether what the impression presents is what is actually there, or only what first appears. The pause is not delay in the pejorative sense. It is the application of the only tool that distinguishes a considered life from a merely reactive one. His students were, by most accounts, transformed by the experience of studying with him, not because he was charming, though he may have been, not because his arguments were technically impressive, though they were, but because the man standing at the front of the room had actually lived what he was teaching, under conditions that would have broken a philosophy that was only theoretical, and had emerged with the philosophy intact. The pause he spoke of was not a concept he had inherited and was passing along. It was something he had discovered, and the discovery had been made in the hardest possible classroom, and it had held. The room in Nicopolis where he taught was probably small. The students probably sat on benches. The lamp would have been necessary in the evenings, and the man at the front, freed now, teaching freely, his old constraint dissolved into history, but still informing everything, would have stood with the particular quality of stillness that the ancient sources consistently attributed to him, and would have asked his students, in his direct and undecorated way, what had arrived for them today, and whether they had been its master or its passenger. Abraham Lincoln was not a Stoic by training. He had not read Epictetus or Seneca, or if he had encountered them, he did not say so in any document that has survived. What he had instead was an intuition about delay, a practical understanding, arrived at through his own experience of his own volatility, that what he wrote in the heat of a feeling and what he chose to release into the world were two different things, and that the distance between them was worth maintaining. During the Civil War, when the pressure on him was of a kind that had no peacetime equivalent, military disasters, incompetent generals, political enemies in his own cabinet, the deaths of hundreds of thousands of men whose lives had been placed in decisions that passed through his hands, he developed a practice that his secretaries knew about and that historians have documented. When something enraged him, he wrote. He wrote fully, without restraint, with the complete force of what he felt at the moment of feeling it. He addressed letters to generals who had failed him, to officials who had crossed him, to critics who had made his work harder. He wrote what was true for him in that moment, with no softening, and then he set the letter aside. He would mark some of them in his own hand, never sent. He would fold them and put them in a drawer and return, when the feeling had had time to move through him and settle, to compose something else, something that said what needed to be said without the raw heat of the initial impression still in the ink. The letters he sent, the words that went into the world and had consequences, were the ones written after the pause. The ones written before the pause went into the drawer, and the drawer held them, and they did their work there, which was to be the place where the feeling had been fully expressed without being released as action. This was not a philosophy he had learned from books. It was a practice he had arrived at through the specific education of his own character, the recognition, which is itself a kind of wisdom, that the first version of a response is not always the right one, and that the feeling which demands immediate expression is not, by virtue of its demand, deserving of it. He had a quick intelligence, and by his own account, and the accounts of those who knew him, a temper that could run hot when it was stoked. The drawer was his own invention, his own private Stoic practice, his own method of widening the space between stimulus and response, far enough for something more considered to have room to exist. What he released into the world from that wider space was different, not cold, not diminished. He was not suppressing himself by setting the first letter aside. He was allowing himself the time to choose which version of himself would speak, the one driven by the initial impression, or the one that had had time to ask what the situation actually required and what kind of man he wanted to be in it. The letters he eventually sent retained force, but the force was directed rather than merely expelled. It carried weight rather than heat. The drawer still exists, in a way. The unsent letters have been preserved. Historians read them. What they read in those pages is Lincoln at full amplitude, every feeling present and unedited, the complete human response to the impossibly difficult conditions of his office. And then, beside them in the archive, the letters he sent, measured, purposeful, the product of the pause. The distance between the two is the space Epictetus was describing from the front of a room in Nicopolis 2,000 years earlier. Lincoln had found it on his own through the specific pressure of his own life, and had used it in the same way, for the same reason, toward the same end, to be the person who chose his response rather than the person the response chose. Nelson Mandela walked out of Victor Verster prison on the 11th of February, 1990. He had been inside for 27 years. The afternoon light of the Western Cape was particular that day, bright in the way late summer light is bright in that part of the world, clear and direct and offering no shade. He had not seen it freely for longer than most of the people watching him had been alive. And the thing that struck observers, and that has been recorded in accounts from many directions, was the quality of how he moved, the pace of it, the steadiness. He did not rush. He did not perform composure in the way of a man suppressing something violent beneath it. He moved like someone for whom the space between arrival and response had over many years become not a practice but a property, something laid down in the body itself, in the way certain knowledge eventually stops being something one reaches for and becomes simply part of how one stands. He had not wanted to be imprisoned. This is worth saying plainly, because the equanimity that followed the imprisonment is sometimes misread as acceptance of it, and it was not. He had been imprisoned unjustly for the crime of opposing a political system that treated him and millions of others as less than fully human. The anger at this, the legitimate, well-grounded, proportionate anger, did not disappear in the years on Robben Island and at Victor Verster. He said so himself in various ways across the years. What changed was not the presence of the anger, but his relationship to it. He had learned, in the long enforced quiet of confinement, to observe his own anger rather than to be carried by it, to recognize it when it arrived, to know its shape and its weight, and to ask, in the space between its arrival and whatever might follow, whether the response it was pressing for would serve what he actually wanted to serve. This is not a lesson that comes easily or quickly. 27 years is a long time, and the conditions at Robben Island in particular were designed to be degrading, to strip away precisely the sense of dignity and self-determination that the Stoics had always argued was the one thing that could not be stripped away. Whether Mandela knew the Stoic texts or not, what he described doing in those years was structurally identical to what Epictetus had described from the position of slavery, finding, inside a condition of profound external constraint, the territory of inner governance that the constraint could not reach. He read widely during his imprisonment. He thought carefully. He had time, more time than anyone chooses, to understand the difference between what he felt and what he decided. What he discovered in that territory was not peace in the sense of the absence of feeling. It was the capacity to hold a feeling long enough to ask what it was for. His anger, held in that way, became something other than a pressure that demanded release. It became a source of information. It told him what mattered. It did not tell him what to do about what mattered. That required the pause, the examination, the question directed at the impression before assent was given. By the time he walked out of Victor Verster prison and into that February afternoon, he had spent decades practicing this examination. Not in a philosophy classroom, in a cell. The transition he subsequently led in South Africa was not accomplished without difficulty or conflict, and the accounts of those who worked closely with him during the negotiations that ended apartheid are clear that he was not an easy man or a simple one. He could be demanding. He could hold a position with a tenacity that his opponents found formidable. What was consistently observed across the accounts of people who negotiated with him or opposed him or worked alongside him was that the formidability was not reactive. It did not emerge from provocation. It emerged from the considered application of principles he had had a long time to examine and order and test against the most demanding conditions that circumstances could offer. When he made a concession, it was a decision, not a capitulation. When he refused to concede, the refusal came from the same place. The governing faculty was present and operating. The pause had become, over the decades, indistinguishable from the man. He had arrived at what the Stoics had always called the fruit of the discipline, not the suppression of impulse, not the performance of philosophical composure, but the genuine settling of the inner life into an order that was, by then, simply how he was constituted. Epictetus had taught that this was the goal of all the practice, not to be a person who manages impressions with great effort, but to be a person for whom the management has become second nature, the pause internalized so thoroughly that it is no longer a technique applied from outside, but a quality of the mind itself. The test of whether that transformation had happened was what Mandela demonstrated that February afternoon. He walked out of prison into a world that had waited 27 years to receive whatever he brought, and he brought nothing reactive. He brought the considered self. These 5 lives, the emperor in his tent, the senator in the Senate chamber, the teacher in the small room in Nicopolis, the president at his desk with the unsent letter, the prisoner walking into afternoon light, are not presented as models in the sense of ideals that no one could approach. They are presented as demonstrations. What they demonstrate is that the space between stimulus and response is not a philosophical concept that exists only in the language of ancient texts. It exists in the specific, dated, documented particulars of actual lives, lived under conditions that ranged from the difficult to the genuinely extreme. Each of these people found it under pressure. Each of them found it through practice. Each of them found that what the practice produced was not the absence of feeling, but a different relationship to feeling, a relationship in which the feeling was met, rather than either acted upon immediately or suppressed, held long enough to be understood, and then from that understanding responded to with something proportionate. The Stoic philosophy that runs through all five of these lives was not for any of them a comfortable inheritance. It was a working tool. It was what Epictetus had meant when he insisted that philosophy was not a performance given for audiences, but a practice enacted in ordinary moments, in the moment before a word is spoken, in the decision to set a letter in a drawer, in the quality of stillness that precedes a reply in a chamber full of witnesses. The philosophy did not remove the difficulty of the circumstances. What it offered was a place to stand inside the difficulty that was not entirely at the mercy of the difficulty. Marcus Aurelius understood this as the central project of his inner life, and he wrote about it to himself every night for years because the project required that kind of sustained, quiet attention. He was not trying to solve a problem. He was trying to become a certain kind of person, one sentence at a time, one examined evening at a time, one question returned to again and again in different forms. Had he governed his own ruling faculty as carefully today as he had tried to govern everything else? The tradition these five people inhabited, whether explicitly, as in the cases of Marcus Aurelius and Epictetus and Cato, or intuitively, as in the cases of Lincoln and Mandela, understood the pause not as a pause in the sense of a gap or an absence. It understood it as the fullest and most characteristic expression of what a human mind, at its best, is capable of doing. To receive an impression and hold it, briefly, in the light of the rational faculty before deciding what it means and what it requires. This was, for the Stoics, not a special achievement reserved for philosophers. It was the basic description of what it meant to live as a reasoning being rather than merely a reacting one. The gap itself is ancient. It was named by Zeno, standing in a painted porch in Athens, developed by Chrysippus through long and careful argument, taught by Epictetus from the position of a man who had no freedom left except the one that mattered. It was documented by Marcus Aurelius in the private record of a man trying to do it, night after night, because he understood that understanding it in theory was not the same as doing it in the world. It was practiced by Cato in the Roman Senate, and by Lincoln in a wartime office, and by Mandela in a cell, where the years went slowly and the practice had time to go deep. All of them found the same thing inside the gap, not emptiness, not absence, a quality of attention, quiet, steady, capable of holding an impression without being moved by it before the examination was complete. The Stoics had a name for the faculty that did this work. They called it the hegemonikon, the ruling faculty, the governing intelligence that sits at the center of a person's inner life and decides, if it has been properly cultivated, what shall pass and what shall not, what shall be given assent and what shall be held at the threshold for a little longer, until the light of reason can fall on it clearly enough to see what it actually is. The light does not need to be turned on. That was the Stoic point, and it is what all five of these lives demonstrated in their different ways. The light is there. The ruling faculty is there. The capacity to pause has been there all along, waiting inside the ordinary moments of an ordinary day, present in the breath before a word is spoken, in the hand that has not yet moved, in the sentence that has not yet left the page. The five people described here did not arrive at it suddenly.